Thank you very much. My name's Danny O'Brien, and I'm the International Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Some of this requires an explanation of our viewpoint. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the EFF's role. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the history that Andy's described, because I think that it is very tempting, whether you believe those adages about the regulation-free internet or you didn't, to assume that what we are facing right now is a profound change or a novelty. And in fact, this sort of relationship between regulation and technology and regulation and the internet is something that has been ongoing all the way through this. And rhetoric on both sides would rather attempt to convince you that the nature of the relationship is predetermined. But in fact, it's always been a contested space, and what succeeds and what doesn't, what is a threat and what isn't a threat, has only really emerged after time. And time also has a way of encouraging people to forget the past, and also forget to how we got to the place that we are now. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the early days of the regulation of the internet and what we can kind of conclude about that. A little bit of conversation about maybe what we forgot in the excitement of both victories and losses. And also perhaps what we forgot simply because either we believed our own rhetoric or the rhetoric of others sort of predetermined what we expect now. The Electronic Frontier Foundation was founded in 1990, which is very annoying for me because for almost all the time I've spent there, I've had a non-multiple of 10 years in which to describe how long it is. I'm in one of those moments now where I can tell you it's 29 years old, and that's sort of annoying, right? Because, like, first of all, it starts with a zero, so it's probably 30 years old if we really think about it, and I can't give it a nice round number to give it some sort of historical force, or even hysterical force. But it has been around since 1990. It was formed in the early days of the recognition that, in particular, telecommunications technology, digital telecommunications technology, was going to have a massive effect on people's lives, but also people's civil liberties. So the EFF has always sort of sat in this this interesting area that we're kind of going to discuss, right, between the law, between activism, which can establish new norms and new ways of thinking about the law, and technology. And in particular, what we try and do is preserve or expand some of the values that we kind of tend to embed into human rights or civil liberties, so that those will at least be preserved as we transition into a new environment mediated through technology. Or at the very least, it doesn't get more restricted, that we don't break the open society in our attempts to cope with the change that new technology is providing. 30 years is a long time, but it's a sort of interesting thing, I think, that maybe many of people here will recognize about technology, and this set of technology, is that people are constantly worried that they've missed the revolutionary moment. Right, that they've come in and, like, we've had 30 years and now the internet is settling down and we don't have room to change, and the technology has achieved all of the radical change it's going to achieve. Or they worry that it's sort of accelerating and it's sort of incomprehensible. Well, I mean, I think we're lucky in a sense that we're living in the first 100 years of the transformative nature of digital technology and computing, right? That we're still within a certain number of decades between us and, you know, John McCarthy's work on Lisp, or the nature of transistors, or the nature of a global shared protocol for digital communications. But all of those things kind of stack up over the last 50, 60, 70 years, and I still think we have at least 30 years or so of trying to work out how all of these things fit together and how quickly they're going to change. And, like, my model for that is usually, and I hope that the camera still manages to catch this, this will be recognizable to a bunch of you. This is Stuart Brand's place layers of society, right? Where you have nature, culture, governance, infrastructure, and then at the top here, sort of commerce, and right at the top there, fashion. Okay, and these are going at different speeds in society. You have fashion, and fashion is sort of all over the place, and it's just changing constantly. Commerce, which is under a lot of pressure to rapidly change. Infrastructure, which is often created by commerce and then sort of stabilized potentially by governance. And then eventually you'll have governance, which has to sort of maintain all of this stuff. And then laws can sometimes influence culture, but culture moves pretty slowly. And eventually nature is kind of the bedrock. Nature doesn't change, at least in our experience, as quickly as these other aspects. And so when people think about how law and technology interact, there's always this sense that if the internet is sort of this merging of commerce of infrastructure, then governance is always going to be chasing the change in that area. And that's part of the rhetorical sort of language that Andy describes, right? Where you just say, you know, technology is changing so quickly and the internet is so big and broad and crosses all of these borders that regulation and governance is never going to catch up. This is sort of a very blurred set of lines, right? There are some times where culture does get ahead of governance. And there are some times when, you know, there's a radical revolutionary change in governance that transforms all of these as well. And it's almost like they occasionally sort of shift in lanes. And when I look at this, I always think of it, because maybe I've been living in San Francisco a little bit too long, as a kind of seismic map, right? That occasionally there are these huge pressures that develop in the nature of governance, that governance is perhaps failing or being seen to fail, and it's sort of stuck in a particular mode of governing. And eventually that pressure builds very, very quickly, and it sort of lurches ahead. So even if governance has been moving very slowly, sometimes it makes a huge jump. And that jump can affect culture, it can affect infrastructure and commerce, and it can affect how technology advances, right? And we always sort of assume that technology is deterministic in nature, right? That that we're discovering the nature of technology, and if one person didn't discover it, then someone else would, and the nature of that technological rollout is fixed. And this isn't the case, right? That there are many times and places where how technology is governed can affect its ramifications. So given that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the backdrop was to the early internet laws, and then I'll zoom very quickly to talking about like the set of laws that we're facing now. And I'm sort of doing this really because some of these laws will seem insane, right? Some of these laws will seem to all of our ears like they couldn't work, that it's ridiculous to even propose that they could work, and they would require a huge amount of the restructuring, not only of existing technology, but of future technology. And while all of those things are true, they're not necessarily positions that everybody else holds, and the lessons that you might have embedded in your head, either because you've experienced all these previous eras in internet and technological governance, or you just have this as a backdrop to what you expect law enforcement and regulation to do, doesn't mean that it can't change, and it can't change in a revolutionary or earthquake-like way. So Let's cut back to the 90s, when all of that language about the internet can't be regulated because it's too big, or it can root around censorship, it can and it's borderless and can't be contained by simple law. So even as that was going on, there was a backdrop, and in fact, a lot of that rhetoric was the response to at least a couple of very determined attempts to manage and control how the internet operated. And one of those, well, is the Telecommunications Act of 1997, but the one that people sort of, if they do remember it by this name, there's a Communications Decency Act, and I'm not going to write it all out, but the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So these were both, took place in about 1996 to 1998, so very early days of the internet. And both of these were products of attempts to create an internet in the image of what went before it. So the Communication Decency Act was part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and it had kind of two spokes to it. But the primary spoke of it was a restriction on what could go on the internet. The idea was that you would only be able to have content on the internet that was publicly viewable, that was safe for the children. If you had adult content of any kind, and that's not just sort of pornography, but sort of material that might be shocking to a child, news stories, personal recollections, LBGT content in some jurisdictions, other kind of shocking imagery, then you would have a legal compulsion to lock that down and have some sort of adult check on it. And this really models sort of the media that existed before that, right? Like you would have, voluntary or not, films that would be 18 or over, and there would be an expectation, even if you published a magazine, that if that magazine had adult content, then you would move it up and down the shelves. Libraries might put restrictions on this stuff. And while the United States was probably an outlier in the amount of content it tolerated to be viewable by everyone, that was largely something that was fairly recent historically. That had come out of a very recent struggle over what it meant, what the First Amendment meant, and what free speech meant. So again, one of the things that I want to kind of point out here, because we are talking about the nature of borders, and we are going to talk about what a global internet looks like, that the United States is not particularly exceptional in any of these sort of extremes, and the position it holds moves around, as does all of these other states. If you had the internet starting off or kicking off in 1950s, the idea and the model of what free speech might mean on the internet would be radically different from an internet that emerged, and indeed was somewhat created by the free speech advocates and activists of the late 1960s, right? The 1970s was a period of extreme transformation in the legal understanding of free speech. And some of the ways that we view the laws around the internet and speech came out of that particular moment rather than some sort of eternal truth of the founding fathers. So the Communications Decency Act had this provision and it passed, right? That became the law. And so this very much was sort of the regulatory model that people expected of the internet. And the internet at the time was already an international network. It was predominantly and dominated by the United States, but I was trying to get to it in the United Kingdom via a very complicated set of begging and borrowing university time, and trying to do communal modem links so that we could buy a cable that would go all the way across the United States. But it was spreading, right? There were terminals in Russia. It was connecting across the Pacific. So this was in some ways one of these first attempts to create a global law for the internet. And it was a very American law, right? The very fact that it has this sort of idea of decency meant that, well, under this internet, nudity was probably going to be one of those things that wasn't permitted into this. If you have a German internet, then you would probably have a very different set of things that were decent or indecent. And then you had the DMCA, and the DMCA, it was something that was contingent and came out of the industrial sectors of the United States in the 1990s. The United States, soft power in many ways, comes from its disproportionate size of its media industry. And there was a growing feeling, particularly in the terrifying existential threat that the United States was experienced from, as it turns out, Japan. A lot of people were worrying about what the United States was going to do in the face of the inevitable domination of this tiny island just off the coast of China. And one of their reactions to this was that they were going to become less of a manufacturing base and more a intellectual property country. That basically the United States' core value would come from IP services, microcode, movies, and pizza, as Neil Stephenson wrote at the time, right? So, and with that backdrop, it was very important that this emerging digital communication system protected and preserved the intellectual property of these sectors. And so what you had in there is like a series of papers that were written that said, okay, whatever this information superhighway is going to be, it has to enforce intellectual property. And so this vision relied on a very different idea about technology than I think that we're familiar with now. This posited very strongly that everybody's laptops, everybody's devices, everybody's computer, any node on this internet would be constantly monitoring for infringing copyrighted material, would detect it and either delete it or alert the authorities. And this is one of the first times where I hit something where just describing this kind of sounds insane, right? Like the idea that any part of this network that had like content that you hadn't originally got a very explicit license from the rights holder before you could use it, was and would sort of just shut down if you tried to do this kind of thing, seems both technologically impractical and actually kind of, I overuse, and we all overuse the term Orwellian, but certainly somewhat authoritarian that you would have these systems in place. The passage of the DMCA was also kind of rocky. This proposal was originally put forward and failed to get through Congress in the early 90s. And therefore, its proponents, both within the Clinton administration and without it, actually having lost the sort of democratic debate of this, circumvented the US democratic process and went to the World Intellectual Property Organization, the sort of transnational treaty organizations, and drafted a treaty with a set of the things that it needed in order to achieve this vision, and then brought it back to the United States and says, we've signed this treaty, we now have to enforce this in law, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was that law. Some of you may be familiar with like a couple of its provisions. The first one that people are kind of often familiar with is DMCA takedowns, right? So DMCA takedowns mean that there's a special fast track process for removing content from the internet if what you're doing is pursuing a copyright claim. So other content is you have to go to a court, right? You have to actually make some argument to a judge as to why this person should shut up about what they're saying. DMCA takedowns mean that you can actually directly go to the hosting provider of that and say you have to take that down. There are some niceties about that. That particular ability is sort of carefully cabined with a bunch of systems that are attempting to protect kind of against abuse. With my EFF hat on, I'll say that we don't feel that those are sustained, like those protections don't really work. But the important thing here is that IP has this sort of privileged position on the network in terms of legal frameworks. The other part of the DMCA is what some of you may know as the DMCA 1201 provisions. And what these do is they give a sort of privileged position to copyright protection technologies. And this is super interesting because this actually kind of bleeds out from just the maintenance and enforcement of laws on the internet. Because what DMCA 1201 does is it says that on the internet or not, I can't traffic in a thing that will break a copyright control. And there are criminal prosecutions if I did that, if I try and sell you or even give you a thing that lets you get around the copyright for Netflix systems or any other digital rights management system, DRM system, I'm committing a crime. But I can also not, and this is the wording of the law, I can't even tell you how to do that. So for instance, in the early years of copyright protection, there was an attempt to create a copyright protection around CDs and compact discs, for those of you who remember. Compact discs, this particular protection system was bypassable by using a marker and just drawing around the edge of the compact disc. And we're in this sort of situation where you may have to delete that because allegedly I'm not a lawyer, this is not legal advice. All my friends are lawyers at the EFF, but they get very nervous when I say these kind of things. But that you could at least make some claim that that is a violation of the DMCA. And this sort of hits into a couple of other kind of interesting aspects of this, right? Which is that what we have in this sort of area, so what resolved and what worked and what didn't in this environment? Well, the first thing that happened in the Communication Decency Act is most of it was viewed as unconstitutional in the United States, right? So the CDA was mostly thrown out because the ACLU and the EFF went to the courts and said this is a violation of the First Amendment. So at least the decency part of that sort of vanished. And we can talk about the bit that sort of remained in that, but I'm sort of juggling all these balls and I want to get them all together. In the DMCA system continued to exist, but there are actually a bunch of things in the DMCA that you see the echo of some other kinds of laws. And we don't talk about those so much in the DMCA because we sort of feel that like they just don't work as laws. And that is tech mandates. So the DMCA actually has a bunch of things that kind of look, if you squint at them, as tech mandates, which is to say that they are requirements that you have to use a particular technology or you are forbidden from using another technology. The tech mandate that we see existing in this is the tech mandate of you can't traffic or sell or use anti-circumvention technologies, right? Like you cannot, that is just a business model that no longer exists. You cannot do that. There's also a few other ones that are kind of more moribund. There's 1201K, which talks about in huge detail what you can and can't do when you build a video cassette recorder. And it talks about how you can't have a gain control on it, because what was happening was that people were trying to create anti-copying systems in video cassette recorders, and the way they were doing this is they were kind of minimizing the, I think it was the vertical hold signal, the sync signal, which meant if you made a copy of that, then that would probably get disappear into the noise, and you would lose the hold, right? So the colors would be screwed and you would rotate, right? And what people were doing was getting around with that by just like upping the gain so that the signal would be, and so we're going to stop that, we're going to ban that forever. That is verboten technology. And what happened is that tech mandates kind of ran into the First Amendment, right? We got into the situation where tech mandates, which actually, if you think about it, technology more broadly, are often the bread and butter of laws, right? You say you can't use this particular kind of concrete, right? You must use this kind of wood in this kind of proportion to build buildings, otherwise they fall down. Mandates like this sort of exist, or things that politicians could compare and look at and say, well, why can't we do this in this space? And a lot of the 90s was spent kind of trying to both explain in practice and in rhetoric, like why this didn't work. And the biggest argument was that we're not in the world of video cassette recorders anymore, and the dividing line between a technology and rolling out a technology and just talking about a technology, talking about code, and implementing and rolling it out were collapsing. And this kind of came under the idea of code is speech, right? This is the value, as it were, that boiled this down. And again, for those of you who sort of know the history, code is speech was sort of a fundamental fight that we had, because one of the technologies that the US government wanted to prohibit was strong encryption. And strong encryption, public key encryption, is well, you can think of it as a technology. You can also express it in a few lines of mathematics, right? You say your N and your P's, and you can spell out the RSA algorithm, and maybe you can patent it, but you certainly can't stop people from spreading that information unless you want to prohibit speech. Within the US judicial framework, we have some pretty strong arguments about this, right? And the easiest way that we can convey those arguments is by saying code is this thing, right? We have some protections in the First Amendment against prohibiting certain forms of speech, and code is one of those things. Like algorithms are one of those things. And we sort of succeeded. So the attempt to prohibit the export of strong encryption by having it classed effectively as a munition in the United States export laws eventually became kind of a dead letter, right? It's not actually off the statute books. There are kind of prohibitions around the use of encryption in the same way as there are prohibitions about exporting superconductors supercomputers, or even particular kinds of centrifuges, right? The encryption and certain kinds of software are in that category. But the understanding is that strong encryption is just something that you can't control the export of, or even people talking about it. And I just came from the blockchain conference where everybody's super happy talking about these things, and no one has like bust in and attempted to silence them. So this is sort of the backdrop that we have now. No tech mandates, code is speech, and I would sort of roughly say code is speech, and I would roughly say, I've kind of skipped a bit here on the Communications Decency Act, but I think there's this other one which is like sort of no censorship, right? Like the idea of regulating speech on the internet is certainly seen as a somewhat difficult and a space where regulators tread very carefully. You saw that, for instance, 3 or 4 years ago, oh God, maybe longer actually, maybe 5 years ago, with the fight over SOPA-PIPA, right, which was an attempt to create a government-mandated censorship system, again to protect rights holders, copyright having this sort of primacy in the United States governance system. And following a huge protest about that, this line was sort of established. The point of doing all of this explanation about what has happened in the past is that these things are contingent. These are things that were fought for and were successfully either defended or sort of created, right? There are a set of frameworks that where we both kind of explained that this is a value that we kind of want to defend. We explained that like if you try and get around these things, it will just turn out to be kind of impractical. It just won't be good governance. And also this idea that it might just be impossible, right? It might just be that we're dealing with technology where censorship is really not possible. And that like we have to think of code as speech because we can't discriminate between the two. And there are no tech mandates because if you try and have a tech mandate, that'll be out of date within a couple of years. And also it's sort of a weird thing to try and introduce into an environment where people can go from thoughts into implementation without having to go through some sort of industrial process where they get a stamp if they've done all the right things. They can just go onto the internet and do it. So all of these are sort of tied to the technology, but they're also sort of connected to almost a kind of agreement between regulators and their technical advisors about what is practical and what is popular and unpopular. All right. So the funny thing like this is like the beginning of the Lord of the Rings movies, like some things get forgotten over time. And while we sort of have this in the back of our heads, we've sort of forgotten that these things are contingent and can be changed at any time, right? Some of this is to do with perceptions about the technology, right? Some of it is to do with values, right? Some of this is to do with the fact that we just think that these things are worth defending. And some of them are to do with where politicians decided that this fight is no longer worth it. Like what is the political capabilities of what they're doing. And now we're entering into a time where this stuff has been kind of around long enough for people to look at it and just assume that it's the way the world is. But we now have a new generation of lawmakers, technologists, general public that's sort of going, well, why? I mean, why? Who came down from God and said that these things should be the case, right? In particular, the political environment has changed all around the world. And some of these things, well, almost none of these things have sort of like been burnt into constitutions or been made explicit. They're all utterly implicit assumptions that are ready to be challenged. And we're seeing them now being challenged. And I think this is one of those cases where regulators are sort of ahead of the technologists, because as technologists, we don't have to think about this. This is the backdrop of our lives, right? Whereas actually this is the stuff that the emerging politicians and the general public are going, we could do this, why not? Again, I would say I just came from this blockchain conference, and I was listening to Vitalik Buterin, who is the founder of and creator of Ethereum, which is one of the major sort of blockchain technologies, and he was being interviewed by Tyler Cowen. And at one point he just said in this very throwaway way, well, you know, a lot of this technology is mediated by what we know about what is permissible and what isn't. And, you know, we know that code is speech. And we know that, like, the internet permits anonymity. And this means that the following things happen, right? And I'm sitting there, and you can't, like, yell at the television set or the radio station when you have podcasts, when you're listening to a podcast. So I guess I just looked like a crazy person on the street. But I was saying, you know, these are contingent. This does not have to be this way. And what I'm next going to do is talk about the laws that are challenging this kind of thing. And trying to give a backdrop, because the people arguing for these laws are still kind of the same people who were pushed to a stop by these kind of internal agreements. So the first one I'm going to talk about is actually the one that I think probably affects engineers and technologists the most directly. And that's two bills, two acts now, in fact, because we couldn't stop them. One in the United Kingdom and one in Australia. The United Kingdom law is called the Investigatory Powers Act, and in Australia it's the, I always get it wrong because it has two A's in it, but it's the Access and Assistance Act, and that was passed at the end of last year. I'm going to concentrate on the Investigatory Powers Act just because this was the one that was first and is already having the ramifications. The Investigatory Powers Act came as a result of the Snowden revelations. So do I have till, what time do I stop? Is it 5:30? Is it 5:30 or 5:45? Okay, good. All right, then I will expand to fill the time available. So the Investigatory Powers Act was a response to the Snowden revelations in a very interesting way. I'm from the UK, and I can tell you that the passage of surveillance law in the United Kingdom follows this pattern. The government tries to get as much surveillance powers as it can. Somebody takes them to court over it. The courts say, well, we can't say this is unconstitutional because we don't actually have a constitution, but this seems to have gone rather too far, so we're going to throw out the worst things. And then the government passes another law that says, okay, we really mean it this time, and then it gets challenged again. The Investigatory Powers Act came about because everybody suddenly went, oh, it turns out GCHQ is doing all these terrible things. Isn't that against the law? And the courts said, well, it's not against the law, but no one actually said that they could do it. So what GCHQ has to do is to write a law that says we're allowed to do these things, and if you pass that, then it'll be legal, right? So the US government set about writing a law to describe what GCHQ did so that they could therefore make it legal. And the problem with surveillance of the internet, which has been pretty much in the domain of the intelligence community since the 90s, is that the intelligence community's job is kind of to break the law, right? Like the whole point of the intelligence community is that they're spies. They go into other countries and they break those countries' laws by monitoring them, possibly assassinating them, certainly not doing the kind of thing that the governments in those countries would like the members of the public to do. So it's sort of like writing a law that says you're allowed to break the law. What we've seen in surveillance law is an attempt to square this kind of thing is we create artificial divisions like, well, you can't break the law in the United States, but you can break the law anywhere else. Or you can break the law when you're pursuing agents of a foreign power, but you can't do it to American citizens. And every country has kind of followed that form. The problem that they struck with the Investigatory Powers Bill was twofold. One, this power and capability is no longer something that the government can pursue on its own terms because the internet infrastructure is there's very small part of it that is government operated. Most of it is mediated through private actors. And the difference between sort of the large private actors and individual private actors is utterly blurred. This is the thing that we talked about with the no-tech mandate, right? That you may be able to create some sort of system where you can compel British Telecom or Verizon to do something because they're a big stable industry. But when you have, Jerry Yang starting Yahoo or Google operating, in the Stanford campus or Mark Zuckerberg starting Facebook, they're sort of individuals. They're very small fry, right? And also somebody on 4chan, somebody setting up a node. The dividing line between, Bill Gates at one hand and Richard Stallman cranking out code another, the line is not very clear cut. So we enter into this problem where in order to allow the intelligence community to break the law, we have to work out, well, how are we going to commandeer everybody else to break those laws too? The second part of the problem is that this technology, I mean, Carl, we're talking about this earlier, is incredibly powerful, right? If you could conduct mass surveillance over everybody in your country or everybody in the world, you know where they are, you know what they're talking about, you know who their friends are, then that solves a lot of regulatory problems, right? And again, the predecessors to the Investigatory Powers Bill in the United Kingdom started off by saying the intelligence community is allowed to conduct this kind of surveillance. And also, other people who might need to use this will interpret it broadly. And within a couple of years, the Milk Marketing Board wanted it to be able to judge milks. Local authorities were saying, you know what, we have a lot of problem with people claiming that they're in school districts and sending their kids to the good school, whereas in fact they live somewhere else. Why don't we just conduct a sort of mass surveillance program and then we'll be able to sort out that problem? Mass surveillance solves, allegedly, almost every problem that a government has. That's why the East Germans spent a lot of time creating a Stasi, right? It's very powerful, and the only thing that stops it is the fact that the general public would be extremely annoyed if the police could come in and kick down their doors and just go rifle through all of their belongings. And we can do this for secret, something they'd never know. It's great. So that's the other problem here, right? Is as soon as you reveal that the spooks and the spies have this incredible power and we're okay with that, everybody else wants a piece of the action. So the Investigatory Powers Act solved this in the following ways. First of all, it allowed this power for a huge swathe of government. And secondly, it created a requirement on technologists to comply with these demands. So basically, any of these bodies can give a technology company an order to say, you have to help us. And this is the bit where I sort of really emphasize that I'm not making this up. In the provisions of the Investigatory Powers Act, there's a special provision that says, and whatever they tell you to do, that's legal. So, and this is get around, awkward laws like the data protection laws or privacy requirements or the laws that kind of prevent the ordinary members of the public spying on other ordinary members of the public. That's all out of the window because now you are the spies. And the other reason why they had to do this, right, is because of this whole no-tech mandate problem, right? This whole problem of anyone could have the power to both spy on a lot of people or stop people from spying on a lot of people. So there's a person, Moxie Marlinspike, who is the primary progenitor, I would say, is probably not the primary author of Signal. And Signal is like WhatsApp. It's a communications instant messaging system, and it has the attribute that it's got pretty good, strong cryptography on it. There's some interesting stuff that we can talk about in the Q&A. Moxie's just this guy, Moxie wrote the code and put it up on iPhone, and lots of people downloaded it. I think he just left Twitter, so he had some money. And some other people gave him some money, so he's still cranking out the code in a small office in San Francisco. And what this means is that everyone who wants to use a secure encrypted communication systems can download Moxie's code. Same thing goes for WhatsApp. The protocol that was developed for Signal was adopted by WhatsApp. WhatsApp is Facebook, right? But Moxie is Moxie. And there could be any number of Moxies, right? So what you need in a law like this is you need sort of this ability to kind of say, you can't do this and you can do this to make tech mandates, but you have to be able to do it on a sort of casual basis, and you have to be able to get anyone to do it. They have to be able to break down a door and say, hey, stop working on that blockchain stuff because it actually promotes the sort of financial behavior that we disagree with, and we need to be able to monitor that. So I need you to write this code in this particular way. And you can't tell anyone, right? Because if you tell anyone, they'll just start using Mox's code, or they'll start using WhatsApp, or they'll start using Ethereum, right? You have to stop, and you have to lie to your customers. This is an incredible sort of violation, not only the no-tech mandates, but also the code of speech, the backdrop of this whole thing. And you could see this popping up all around the world. So it actually first started in the United States, and you may have remembered it was sort of blinded a little bit because there was also in the middle of the Trump election period. But in the San Bernardino Apple case, right? So there was this big case that suddenly became public where the FBI was asking Apple, well, asking in the way that only the FBI can ask, which is with a court order, to rewrite the iOS operating system on one device, right, to basically bypass the protections that mean that you can't unlock an iPhone. And Apple fought this much harder, I think, than the FBI thought that they were going to fight it, because San Bernardino it's in California. It was like an awful terrorist attack. And this particular request was very sort of narrowly constructed, right? They weren't asking for a backdoor on every computer, but Apple fought it back because if the government has the right to say, we want you to write technology in this particular way, the sky's the limit, right? Because the only thing that means that an iPhone is an iPhone rather than a spying device that happens to have, you know, a camera, a microphone, a geolocation device, and a barometer, I believe, right? Then it is the software that's in it, right? If you cross that line, then the government can redefine the purpose of almost everything that people have. And that's not only bad for civil society, it's bad for Apple's ability to assert that they're not doing that, right? People's anxiety about technology, you may have noticed, is increasing and increasing. And the reason why it's increasing is that they know at a very profound level that they're handing all of this private information to these somewhat opaque organizations, and they don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And so the idea that not only are they dependent on the goodwill of Mark Zuckerberg, but they're also dependent on the fact that Mark Zuckerberg isn't secretly in there doing whatever the government wants him to do, and who knows which government, right? Like US government maybe, Australian government, UK government, who knows, right? He's under, all of these people are developing laws to get him to do something, destroys the trust between the technology user and the technologist. So these are kind of the defenses, and in the San Bernardino case, EFF actually submitted an amicus where we talked about the First Amendment challenges of compelling someone to rewrite their code. And we actually took a couple of angles. One, under US First Amendment law, you can't compel speech. You can't like tell someone, you have to tell this person that I'm great, right? Like the government can't do that. You have to do it voluntarily afterwards. And also, in particular, you can't compel someone to sign something. And as it turns out, part of the nature of building firmware for a phone is you have to digitally sign it, right? Otherwise, the phone's not going to accept it. So these are arguments within the US legal system. So they have this element of code of speech. But underlying that is, I think, a deeper principle, which is there's something really problematic about compelling other people to say or write things at the behest of governments when that can have almost endless repercussions. So that's the first element of this attack. The second part of this is now happening now that the Investigatory Powers Act that enabled this kind of behavior and the Access and Assistant Bill in Australia has passed. This is an attempt really to change these norms, these global norms. And you know, you've got 2 of the 5 eyes now, so this norm is gradually shifting. One of the things that's sort of unbelievable about this, and people we had real problems convincing anyone to stand against the Investigatory Powers Act. And one of the reasons is we seemed like extremists, right? So we read it through and we said, we really read this as saying that the UK government can compel not only large companies, but individual software and hardware developers to act as spies. And everybody said, no, I don't think that's really, I mean, they're trying to create a access to data law enforcement regime that matches what they had previously when they could just go to British Telecom and ask somebody to wiretap phones. This is the model that we're trying to achieve. But as it turns out, like in order to do that in this environment, you actually kind of do have to have that power. You have to have that power to reach out to Richard Stallman. And what happened was, well, first of all, GCHQ said, we'll make this clear in our codes of practice. And then the codes of practice said, actually, we do mean this. They actually said, so when we're talking about telecommunication providers, this does include, for instance, your local cafe, right? So they could go to a local cafe and say, we would like you to run this software that will install malware on particular visitors to your cafe. And in the Australian bill, there's a table. I really encourage people to read it because one of the reasons why there's more of an outcry about the Australian bill is it's smaller and you can read it. And there is a table sort of on the first page. The British are much better than the Australians at burying this stuff. But there's a table on the front page of the Australian bill that basically says, yes, like we're specifically talking about persons in the sense of natural persons rather than persons that are large institutions. And of course, this applies around the world. We're finally getting to the bit that Andy sort of talked about, which is the idea of these as globally applicable bills, right? The Australians and the British assert their ability to change the code that is running on everybody's machines. And again, I'm sort of reaching this at this sort of side angle because I think the response of most technologists and most people who are used to the era when all of these things are true is to go, well, that's impossible. They're just not going to be able to do that. Australia can tell Australians what to do, and screw it, I'll just download and use Mox's tools, right? And like he will never be able to go to Australia, so we'll win. And we'll use Richard Stallman's code, right? Because that's auditable and open source. And it's a very tempting thing to do because that's ultimately kind of the reason why we thought that these rules were cast in stone. And it's also kind of the backstop. Like when John Gilmore said the internet roots, censorship has damage and roots around it, it's not a kind of like brave stand, it's a description of the way things are, right? It's just going, look, this isn't going to work, so if this is your public policy goal, you're gonna have to come up with something different. And we came up with something different, and we're in the environment where some bits of the DMCA work and some bits don't. And some bits of the Communications Decency Act were thrown out as unconstitutional, and some bits kind of operate the way that they used to. But this is all based on this peaceable negotiation, and that can change very quickly. I'll pick on the next one and then we'll do Q&A and I can tell you about all the other terrible laws that are going on, right? So the next one is Article 13 and Article 11 of the of the copyright and the digital single market. So this is the return of IP into the world of controlling and regulating the internet. EFF came into this pretty late, although we've been monitoring it for a long time. This is an EU directive. And we've been monitoring it for 2 years, but it seemed so insane that, that I was actually relatively confident that it was never going to get anywhere. We often hit bills where we just go, this would be terrible if true, right? Terrible if passed, right? When we were talking earlier about little devices that are in every computer that make sure that like copyright violations don't happen, there was actually a bill on the books in the 2000s to implement this. They were going to be called, what were they called? The Fritz chips, right? Because there was after Senator Fricks. Anyway, so it's a law in the books, and we fought it a little bit, but in the end we kind of went, like, this is so extreme that no one's actually going to support it. Article 13 and Article 11 are two proposals, and I'll concentrate on Article 13. Article 13 says that we've got this terrible problem with copyright infringement on the internet. So what we'll do is that any service that allows you to upload content to be shared with the rest of the world has to put in an algorithmic filtering and tracking thing that will come up and say, this is copyrighted content, and refuse to allow you to upload it. And this will have to be implemented on every uploading system that operates in Europe. So this is like, historically, this is exactly the same as this sort of 90s IP model of the internet. And you sit there and go, okay, well, that's not going to work. So like, what are they doing? This is a stalking horse for some other proposal that is going to be much more, by comparison, a much more realistic thing. But it wasn't, and it did in fact get embedded. It is now in the process of being the I's dotted and the T's crossed in a negotiation between the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the member states. It's very close to becoming law. And again, this sort of falls into this category of no tech mandates. Like, well, how did we get into this position? Well, partly we got into this position because we're still dealing with people who are relatively ignorant about what the capabilities of government are going to be, right? But we're also dealing with an internet and an environment where they have someone that they can order around, right? It's not, to their eyes, it's no longer this question of like, we have 1 million people around the world and how are we going to enforce this, right? It's that if we can target YouTube and Facebook and SoundCloud, right, and maybe a few other big companies, then we can probably win, right? Like if we get all of those people to comply with this, then we have a revenue stream, right? We can restrict copyright infringement on those sites, and we don't need the rest of it. We can just cope with that. So from a political point of view, that seems a very compelling prospect, right? You can assert your view of how the internet should be globally, because most of these companies are about 50 miles radius from here. And in the traditional model of this, and the ones we talked about before, that would have worked because it's the US government imposing this kind of law, right? The US government has successfully exported the DMCA provisions to the rest of the world, because if you want to get something removed from YouTube, you use the DMCA provisions, even if the DMCA isn't the law of your country, right? Because Google behaves as though it is the law of the land in every other country. So they feel that they can do that. Interestingly, they're currently, and this is where I sort of take this very topically, they're currently in this terrible situation where their kind of model of what they want to achieve and how far they can get is sort of rubbing against the values that they want to replace with all of this. So when we talk about no tech mandate, code of speech, no censorship, right? There are conflicting and alternative models. Like I said, there was a model of the internet that would be protect against intellectual property. There is a model of technology that says that you will have to get an agreement before you tell someone else about this technology, or you would go to jail if you don't do that. And those are viable alternative value systems. And if you believe in those and you don't believe in these things, then this stuff is just, ink on a whiteboard, right? This has no place in your value system. What that means is when you're passing laws like this and somebody says, well, you just can't do that because it won't work, so the internet will root around censorship. They go, well, what do we need to do to stop that from happening? Right? And so right now, we're actually in this odd position with the copyright directive, in that we won. We have 4 million people who basically implicitly have these values because they grew up with the internet. And they all wrote to parliamentarians in Europe and said, this is a terrible idea. The parliamentarians tried to stop it, and then they were sold a compromise, right? The compromise sort of said, well, we can go into the details, but like one of the bits of the compromise is, well, how about if we make it so that it only applies to YouTube, and it only applies to SoundCloud, and it only applies to companies that are like bringing in $20 million or more of revenue, or have less than, say, more than 3 million users, right? And therefore, if there are other parts of the internet where this is important for people to be able to just talk, then they can do it there, and we can deal with these companies. Well, right now, France and Germany are in this huge fight because Germany wants to maintain those principles because, you know, they want companies to be able to compete with Google and YouTube and SoundCloud and so forth, right? They want to have a vibrant EU technological environment that can still rely on these kind of rules. And the French are saying, no, you don't understand, this is a moral duty, right? These companies are violating copyright. Right, and if just because they're making less than $20 million doesn't mean they're not, like, you know, violating the rules of intellectual property. It's got to be everyone. And the last I heard is that Macron and Angela Merkel are literally talking to each other to try and work out what this agreement will be. It's a ridiculous compromise, right? You know, if you carve it out that way, then all that means is you've created this sort of Potemkin village of companies that are allowed to basically use the internet and communicate with one another without this like massive infrastructure. But the moment they poke up their heads above, like, basically the point at which they might be competitive with Google, they're wiped out, right? Like they cannot, they'll have to go, actually we can't take any more people, because if we take any more people, they'll come for us, and we'll have to buy the copyright filtering technology, which is of course primarily owned by Google, Apple, so forth. So we have this super interesting environment right now where these values are being challenged. I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions, because I sort of feel like I've walked you around the context to all of this, but I haven't got the meat of what you really want me to say, which is how will countries like impose their viewpoint on us and the rest of the world, and like which countries are doing it. And so you can ask those questions and I'll be happy to do it. But this is the environment that we find ourselves in, and this is why it's super important for technologists and engineers to step up and defend these values, because if we don't, we're going to be in a very different internet and a very different tech environment. So, thank you.